Is the Iran war breaking out again? Iran has used the ceasefire to lay more mines in the Strait of Hormuz. Trump, meanwhile, announces the destruction of those mine layers responsible for this. Meanwhile, it is unclear whether Iran will continue negotiations at all, and accordingly, whether the ceasefire will end and the fighting will continue. We want to discuss this and all other updates in this Iran war situation report. Holy cow, now save the most with my code at Holy. The U.S. aircraft carrier, USS George H.W. Bush, is now in the CENTCOM area of responsibility. This means that there are currently 3 aircraft carriers, namely the USS Gerald R. Ford, the USS George H.W. Bush, and the USS Abraham Lincoln, in the area of responsibility of the U.S. Central Command. This means that for the first time since 2003, a naval power is present on site with 3 aircraft carriers. And since the beginning of the Iraq War, this is now the largest U.S. naval force on site. And with that, the U.S. now has additional options in the event of a renewed outbreak of war. Meanwhile, the Iranians have released a video showing how they board one of the ships they have seized. Here we see one of the small boats arriving and the soldiers climbing up the ladder. And of course, this clearly shows that it's a staged video, because here a side opening has been made and a ladder has been lowered. This is usually used by pilots. Accordingly, this is staged, which of course shows us how much Iran is also concerned about its external image here. By the way, the U.S. government has stated, or rather Trump has stated, that they will ignore the hijacking of cargo ships because they were not American or Israeli ships. Meanwhile, it is being reported that Iran has laid new mines in the Strait of Hormuz. Estimates now suggest that over 100 mines have been laid. At the beginning of the ceasefire, there was talk of fewer than 10. That means Iran has now used the time to lay more mines in the strait, effectively consolidating its control over the Strait of Hormuz. Because the more the strait is mined, the more ships are forced to travel through Iranian territorial waters, allowing Iran to exercise control. Donald Trump then declared that he had announced the sinking of all mine layers if they were to mine the strait. That means, according to the U.S. government, they are now prepared to use force there. At the same time, however, he also ordered that efforts to clear the mines be tripled. There have already been reports that the U.S. is already working on clearing the mines that were laid. Now the intensity of those efforts is supposed to be increased accordingly. Meanwhile, the U.S. reports that 34 ships have now been rerouted because of the blockade. And here we see, interestingly, that U.S. Central Command says it's a blockade of the Iranian ports, not a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, as Trump, for example, has announced, where a line is drawn here between Oman and the border of Pakistan, indicating where the blockade is, because that would again be illegal under international law, whereas a blockade of the ports is indeed legal. We talked about this with an international law expert on the Extras channel. However, while the blockade is in place, numerous Iranian tankers managed to bypass the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, and yet they continue to sail into international waters, out into the open sea, or return to Iran. The reason for this is probably that they are using territorial waters. In other words, here is roughly the line where the Americans announced the blockade, and if the Iranians, of course, sail along the coast, can they continue to travel through Pakistani territorial waters into Indian territorial waters, and thus ensure that they are within the waters of neutral states and therefore are not intercepted? That allows them to continue traveling and to conduct further trade. A solution would certainly be possible here for the USA, but they would have to effectively board the ships in Iranian territorial waters before they enter Pakistani waters, or after they leave Pakistani territorial waters heading west toward Iran. But since the 12-mile zone, that is, territorial waters, is only 12 miles, this would mean that the helicopters with which the American soldiers would then board these ships, that they would move into the range of Iranian air defenses, which of course would then require attacking these air defenses and could subsequently lead to a renewed outbreak of war. That's why it will probably be avoided for the moment. But that doesn't mean that this couldn't still change. There are also changes regarding Lebanon. So now the ceasefire between the Israelis and Hezbollah, or rather Lebanon, has been extended by 3 weeks in order to reach a solution. Israel's foreign minister has also emphasized that there are no serious differences between the two countries and that the only obstacle to peace is Hezbollah. However, Lebanon itself wants to stop the destruction of houses in the south, which are currently being destroyed by the Israeli army in order to establish a security zone there. And Lebanon does not want to accept a buffer zone. Lebanon is therefore demanding a withdrawal from Lebanon. That is a condition and is probably the prerequisite for an agreement with Israel. Israel will only withdraw not until Hezbollah has been disarmed. As long as Hezbollah is armed, Israel rules this out. And that is probably one of the most important problems between the two countries at the moment. However, Lebanon had also decided on the disarmament of Hezbollah. So in theory, this could actually align with Israeli interests. Accordingly, the Lebanese president has also given instructions to continue pushing forward with disarmament, including by confiscating weapons depots. So further measures by the Lebanese armed forces are expected to follow in order to disarm Hezbollah. At the same time, Lebanese media report that troop presence in the capital has been increased, including around the government palace. That's what I think. This could be interpreted as preparing for the possibility that Hezbollah might attempt a coup and wanting to have their own forces on the ground to prevent it. Things are also continuing in Iraq. There, the U.S. is increasing pressure on Iraq so that the Shiite militias, which are mostly loyal to Tehran, will be disarmed. The U.S. is now suspending the funding and training of counterterrorism units of the Iraqi armed forces in order to further increase the pressure. And at the same time, it is reported that $500 million in cash, which were planned to be flown into Iraq, are proceeds from Iraqi oil sales. This money is being withheld by the U.S. Federal Reserve. So, in this way, massive pressure is also being exerted on the Iraqi state to force it to disarm the Shiite militias and thus take away one of Iran's proxies. Massive pressure. Today's sponsor comes in, namely when your data is on the internet and being traded. But let's go straight to this advertisement. Do you know what really annoys me? Unwanted emails or even calls. Today's sponsor, Incogni, has a very simple business model. For a small fee, our data is deleted from the internet. We all click to accept terms and conditions on the internet that we haven't read at all, often even with free offers. In doing so, we often agree to the collection of our personal data, which is then sold to data brokers. That's not just our email addresses and names, but often also our date of birth, home addresses, and buying and browsing behavior. Every search query, every product you look at can ultimately be recorded. This data can then be used for spam, but also for many other things. Insurance can become more expensive if your behavior is considered risky because of your browsing history. Banks can deny loans if the data suggests a lack of willingness to repay. Incogni is here to prevent exactly that. Basically, it ensures that we don't have to pay all the costs for what we use for free on the internet. You sign up, give the company permission to act on your behalf, and then they get to work deleting your data. I can track the progress directly and see that my data has already been deleted from 167 data brokers. If the brokers cause any problems, Incogni keeps at it until my data is gone. Month after month, they continue to protect my privacy. New entries are immediately deleted again by Incogni. In the meantime, Incogni even offers removals upon request. So, when you request it, Incogni enforces deletion on a specific website. If you also want to take back your privacy, then click the link in the description. By doing so, you not only support the channel, but you also get a 60% discount when you use my link. Since September 2024, I have an annual contract, so they keep deleting my data continuously, and now I receive significantly fewer emails. Thanks for supporting the channel. Now let's get back to the video. At the same time, of course, there are also developments. Inside Iran itself, there is also movement. There are now reports that mass layoffs are taking place in ports and large industries. The reasons for this are, of course, obvious. The ports have much less trade because of the blockade imposed by the USA. And with steel mills, there have been bomb attacks on the plants during the military actions of the past weeks. And this certainly led to a reduction in the required workforce. So this worsens the economic situation, and damages and the lack of trade are making things worse. which is what the Iranian government is facing. Trump himself states that there are massive power struggles within Iran. We have repeatedly addressed this here on the channel. And following that, there have been a number of statements from the three branches of government. So, on the one hand, from the Speaker of Parliament, Ghalibaf, from Pezeshkian, the President, and from the head of the judiciary, Ali, however you pronounce his name. All three of them have stated, more or less in the same way, that there are no conflicts among them, and they also point out that there are no hardliners or moderates. They are all Iranians and revolutionaries, and they all stand together behind the current system, etc., just to emphasize that they will not let themselves be divided. The foreign minister also emphasizes unity, the government and the country's leadership, and certainly this is to be understood as a demonstration of unity. Also because of the statements made by Donald Trump. But basically, it must be understood that there are simply no moderates in the Iranian leadership, regardless of whether the media sometimes label someone as a moderate or not. Because such a totalitarian system, which has been in control for decades, naturally creates its own class, all of whom are aligned when it comes to political beliefs. And while there are no moderates, there are only those who are willing to consider non-military means to achieve their goals and who may be willing to make some concessions during negotiations. For example, Ghalibaf was a brigadier general in the Revolutionary Guards. You don't get to that position by being a moderate. A moderate doesn't become a general in the Revolutionary Guards. However, there is obviously a conflict between Wahidi and those who are willing to make concessions. And we can rather call them pragmatists because they do share the same opinion. They have the same radicalism of the Islamic Iranian Revolution within them. However, they are pragmatic and therefore willing to make concessions on certain issues. But this should not be misunderstood as them thinking fundamentally differently, but rather that they are only somewhat different in how they pursue that course and go about achieving their goals. The head of the Revolutionary Guards, Wahidi, is obviously also willing to continue the war. That remains clear. A large part of the negotiating position of their own team was accordingly rejected by Wahidi. That means those who negotiated with the US in Islamabad have returned, and the Iranian leadership of the Revolutionary Guards has said, "What your position was is not acceptable to us at all." And it must be clear that this makes further negotiations enormously difficult. Effectively, it is the Revolutionary Guards generals who are setting the tone. That's basically what we've heard in the past, where Iran experts have said that if there were a decapitation strike, it would indicate or result in a military dictatorship by the Revolutionary Guards. And right now, there are signs that indicate exactly that. CBS News reports on this. They report that Iran's military is still significantly more intact than originally reported. They say that 60% of the Revolutionary Guards' navy still exists. That may be technically true. However, these are likely mainly those small boats that are usually used as recreational boats or fishing boats. Realistically, it's not to be expected that the majority of them have already been destroyed. We've talked about this in the past, but this has to be understood in the right context. That doesn't mean that there are still large numbers of submarines or surface forces, any frigates or corvettes, existing and ready for combat. Another claim is interesting, and that 2/3 of the Air Force are operational. That needs to be viewed with some caution, because first of all, the question is, what is the standard by which 2/3 are considered operational? Because on paper, Iran had a relatively large air force. However, the prevailing opinion among experts was that the majority of these aircraft were not airworthy. That means they were never operational at any point. And in my opinion, the claim that 2/3 of the total number of Iranian aircraft are still operational is therefore nonsense. However, what could be the case is that this assumption is based on the aircraft that not only existed on paper, but were actually airworthy, and that 2/3 of those survived. If we look at this, we've seen a number of aircraft destroyed in the videos, but not too many. Of course, that doesn't mean that more aircraft weren't destroyed. After all, no one is forcing Israel and the US to release every single video. So that doesn't mean they weren't destroyed. However, before the war, there were also videos from the Iranians showing that they not only stored their missiles and missile launch vehicles in underground caverns, but that they also have aircraft caverns where additional planes can be parked. So it's likely that some of the aircraft were secured in this way before the outbreak of the war, in order to ensure their survival. Because from the Iranian military leadership, we don't see that they acted completely irrationally, but rather that they assessed the situation relatively correctly. And accordingly, it was clear that their fighter jets would have no chance in a direct confrontation with the US and Israel. The only sensible thing to do then is to bring a substantial portion of the aircraft to safety in order to prevent them from being destroyed. So the fact that these underground aircraft caverns were filled with planes is at least realistic and therefore somewhat likely. And then, in fact, 2/3 of the aircraft that were originally combat ready at the start of the war could have survived until now. As for diplomacy, there are opposition media that claim the negotiating delegation and Mojtaba's office, which is dominated by the Revolutionary Guards. The situation there led to the negotiating delegation not coming to Pakistan because Mojtaba's office had refused and prevented them from leaving the country. And here again, Mojtaba is probably alive, even though there are always other claims. However, it is assumed that on the one hand, he has suffered amputations, and on the other hand, he will have reconstructive surgeries, meaning those that restore body parts. This probably concerns his face in particular, and that's why there are no video or audio recordings of him, probably to prevent him from appearing weakened. Reports say communication with him would occur only through messengers. Accordingly, the effective control lies with the Revolutionary Guards. That's how it should be understood at this point. Nevertheless, Arakchi is traveling to Pakistan. That's the foreign minister. Afterwards, he will continue on to Oman and Moscow. And according to the reports, it's about the negotiations themselves. That means I would understand it as him wanting to explain the Iranian negotiating position to friendly and allied nations. And of course also Pakistan, which acts as a mediator between the US and Iran. He is not currently traveling for negotiations with the US itself. And according to the latest reports, they have not been announced again yet either. Fars News, which is state-run, meanwhile emphasizes that the Strait of Hormuz is effectively Iranian. There is no need to negotiate about it anymore. It is completely pointless to negotiate about it. Uranium enrichment is a red line that they are not willing to give up. And then it is also written, I quote here, Trump and his team, in addition to their open threats, are also sending indirect messages through intermediaries. This dual strategy shows that the main goal is to test Iran and to convey an image of strength, but not to solve the problem. Negotiations under such circumstances do not lead to results, but instead allow the United States to appear as the winner at minimal cost. Experience has shown that there have already been 2 attacks during the negotiations. Therefore, it is foolish to continue negotiating after such incidents. As I said, this is a position published here by Fars News, which is therefore understood to be close to the government. That does not mean it is the sole view of the government. But we can understand that this is definitely not a position that contradicts what we can expect from the Iranian leadership. Furthermore, it is emphasized that there is no need for negotiations because they can simply respond to any American action in kind. For example, it is mentioned that if oil and gas are attacked, they could attack Israel's oil and gas industry and those of the regional nations. And with that, they could shut down 25 million barrels per day of production for a whole year. If power plants are attacked, they could attack those of Israel and the US allies in the region. That means, from the Iranian side, they emphasize that we actually don't need to negotiate. Because if the US does anything, we simply retaliate in kind, and then there's no need for a solution. According to Fars News, the negotiations are therefore just to help the US save face. That needs to be understood at this point. So if we want to come to a conclusion, the Revolutionary Guards around Wahidi want to effectively prevent negotiations that are anything more than a capitulation by the US. That means, if the negotiations result in concessions from the US, for example, if the US lifts sanctions, then that's okay. But from the perspective of these hardliners, giving in is not necessary and is therefore prevented whenever possible. In return, the US wants to use economic pressure to bring Iran back to the negotiating table in order to achieve concessions on the nuclear program and the missile program. The current problem is that Trump gives the impression that he wants the deal at any cost. And of course, that weakens the American position and strengthens the Iranian position. But whether that's true or not, because it's important to understand here that the impression is not necessarily the result of what is actually happening on the ground. Because every extension of deadlines so far has made Trump appear weaker and has strengthened the Iranians' belief that they can ultimately win. The problem is, as I said, that doesn't necessarily have to be true. In the end, there could very well be a new outbreak of war if Trump stops giving in and extending deadlines at will, and eventually loses his temper. If the blockade is then enforced more strictly, including extending it to Iranian territorial waters and thus preventing ships from directly crossing into Pakistani territorial waters, then Iran will probably soon, and I say soon in quotation marks, have no other choice but to negotiate seriously. 51% of the oil export revenues go to the military, so without oil sales, the Revolutionary Guards will soon have no money left, not even to pay salaries. 95% of Iranian exports move by sea. Trump has stated that it's $500 million a day elsewhere. I've read about $350 million a day. But we're definitely talking about the fact that, under normal circumstances, this should be a death blow to the Iranian economy if the blockade continues. Nevertheless, that doesn't automatically mean it will be the case. For example, here in the Wall Street Journal, we have a commentary that says Iran could very well hold out for quite a while, even with the blockade. I have to be clear here. At some point, I run up against the limits of my knowledge and abilities. I can't judge how willing Iran actually is to keep fighting using any reserves they might have, and to what extent, for example, the Revolutionary Guards are willing to show up for duty, even if they no longer receive a salary. These are questions that simply can't be answered from afar. But it must also be clearly stated that the US is by no means prepared for unlimited further combat operations, just because they now have the third aircraft carrier on site. Because according to media reports, they have fired more than 1,000 Tomahawk cruise missiles, as well as 1,500 to 2,000 anti-aircraft missiles. And in both of these cases, it could take up to 6 years to replace this ammunition if production doesn't ramp up quickly enough. And that could already jeopardize American aid to Taiwan, and of course, the US position in East Asia. A continued war against Iran would therefore weaken the US position, because with each passing day, it would become more doubtful whether the US would help in Asia in the event of Chinese aggression, which in turn would encourage China. And we have already discussed several times here on the channel what it would mean for the US if they were to leave Taiwan to the Chinese. In principle, Trump would actually have to intervene there and shouldn't just watch. But for that, he would of course have to be militarily capable, and that's only possible if his air defense batteries and his ammunition are available, and his ships have cruise missiles that they can fire. And a war against Iran that might be prolonged by months doesn't make this any more likely. That's it for today's situation report. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. That helps with the algorithm. Leave a comment if you have anything to add. If you're new here, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you don't miss future videos. Tomorrow we'll do a situation report on the Ukraine war and the Iran war in the live stream at 8 p.m. German time, followed by a Q&A session. Of course, you can also ask your questions there if anything is still unclear. I would be happy to see you again. And at this point, I'd like to mention the sponsor once more. If you want to make sure that your personal data isn't spread on the internet, then use today's sponsor. That's all from Torsten Heinrich for now. Thank you for your attention, and see you soon. Thanks also to the supporters on Patreon, as well as here on YouTube. I would especially like to thank Lieutenant Colonel Mahamouri and the Lieutenant's Pertainment, Robert Veal, Lichtschetre, Anti-X, Meersman, Malermeister Noggle, Marcus P., Alex Rosenthal, Madbest, Vision Sound Lab, Zickwriter, Silvio Struver, Mütter 1000 Janiscu, Sascha Müller, Cunningham, Oistres, Shadow, Jans vom Eck, Uwe die Frame, Nickname to Bib, Carsten Schulz, Tequila 42. Thank you very much. Without you, this wouldn't be possible.